Yes, we have started the recording. So as a reminder, if you're not comfortable with your image or your name being recorded, go ahead and change those things now and turn off your video. We'll hide all non-video participants. My name is AC. I use they, them pronouns. I'm your moderator for tonight. I'm really excited to be joining everyone for this session this evening. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation after being away from Oklahoma for the last several months. I think really quickly, we want to begin by defining for folks, what carceral feminism is, what Against Carceral Feminism Oklahoma is. And I was involved in the collective at the beginning, and I always fall back to this really beautiful statement that we wrote a few months ago, which is that Against Carceral Feminism Oklahoma is a collective of survivors, organizers, advocates, educators, and community members invested in providing safety and liberation for all marginalized groups. This collective serves as an intervention to end gender-based violence and all other forms of violence without a reliance on policing, prison, surveillance, and other carceral tools. So we reject the use of carceral tools to enact stronger punishments or harsher punishments or any punishments for gender-based violence or sexual violence, other types of oppressive, patriarchal violence, and embrace things like redemption, that all people are redeemable. We resist the use of crime as a barometer of right and wrong, with the understanding that human dignity is not conditional. And that the acknowledgement that prisons and police do not disrupt cycles of harm, they only perpetuate them. Public safety is built in community. It centers on harm reduction. It doesn't involve criminalization or punishment. Put quite simply, right? We are safer and more free in a world without prisons and police. So that's a little bit about us. You can often find information about upcoming Against Carceral Feminism events on the Instagrams of some of the folks you see featured here, as well as on Foundation for Liberating Minds. Just the Instagram @ was stuck in my brain. It's @Foundation for #4, the letter L, the letter M, and I'm sure that information can get dropped in the chat. There is currently a once a month action space, which is, I think, what we're all here for today, that happens across the state. So we invite you to continue to engage with us, as well as other opportunities to be a part of this collective. I'm going to turn it over now. Before I do, please, as our panelists are introducing themselves, please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat this evening. So your name, your pronouns, your location, and what brings you to the space, with the reminder that we're recording. So if you'll share as you are comfortable, we would love to get to know you and why you're here as we build and grow this community together. Let's go around here. I'm going to start with Joshua, who is to my right on the screen, and then we'll go around to introduce yourself.
My name is Josh Higgenbotham. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm one of the organizers for Black Lives Matter OKC, along with Jasmine, actually, and been an educator for about 15 years now. And I actually have been part of the collective Against Carceral Feminism since it began as well.
Great, thank you. Jasmine?
Awesome, thank you, AC. Hi, everybody. My name is Jasmine Brown-Jutras. I am the organizer for the ACLU of Oklahoma. I was also the project manager for the Make It Right project, which was a project here in Oklahoma City that was it was a strategic plan around the community to really target OKC PD and the budget that was created in our city. And so we had some great turnout and some really great strategy that really made me feel that I could be nowhere but honestly honored to be here to talk about this tonight. I think that's all I have for today. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Katrina.
Hello, my name is Katrina Ward. My pronouns are she, they. Also really honored to be here. I am currently in grad school for geography, but I moved to Oklahoma City about 4 years ago, started getting plugged in, met a lot of really great people like AC, who know a lot of what's going on here. And I realized when the budget was coming up for discussion that there wasn't a lot of super accessible language around a lot of those conversations and graphics. So I started this thing called Design for Divestment because my undergrad degree is in graphic design, and I know a lot of graphic designers. So we tried to make things a little bit more accessible for people to get involved.
And Katrina, what was the name of that Instagram that you created to do that project?
Design for Divestment.
Yeah, great. And I'm sure, again, that can be dropped in the chat. So I think I would love to, as we jump in, do another quick round robin before we get deep into our framing questions to just kind of, I think, really help folks understand, what is your role beyond against carceral feminism, maybe in divestment or defunding efforts, and like what you hope is next in the work for you personally. I think each of you kind of touched on that, but I'd love to hear like more specifically. And we can go, I think we'll start with Jasmine and then go to Katrina and then Josh. So we'll just kind of bounce around.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Make It Right project was an action-oriented partnership. And so for what we saw was we had a group that came together and we were reviewing the tragic case of Stadian Rodriguez, and the community just needed a place to do the work. They're like, we're tired of waiting. We don't know what's going on. Everywhere we turn, there is a process on top of another process, on top of another task force, on top of another committee. And it's like the people are dying every day, and there's no accountability anywhere. So let's start with the money, right? And so the Make It Right project was essentially a divestment campaign more so than a defunding campaign. Our goal was to reallocate funding from the traditional policing systems, which we know are harmful and which we know are fatal, and instead reallocating funding to alternative policing measures like I'm sure Josh will talk about a little bit, but like programs similar to the STAR program in Denver, also talking about, sorry, the words just blinked my head, but yeah, so just different alternatives to policing is what our goal was. And we continue to have conversations within the community to push the community to be involved. And a lot of what Katrina said was that we wanted the community to be involved, but it was almost impossible for just the average citizen to do that because it wasn't comprehensive to somebody who's just an average citizen who doesn't do what we do and just is sitting in county, city council meetings because we feel we have to be there, right? Folks have to work, folks have lives, and we have to make sure this is accessible. And so for what I see and what I expect and what I hope for is that Oklahoma City takes this seriously, that this consulting group is able to put forward some real action and real changes in the city with their recommendations. And I really do hope that the city begins to take this seriously moving forward.
So for me personally, I think my dream would be to be able to have funding to organize in the community and actually talk to people and ask them why they feel safe in their communities, and then start talking about some of the issues underneath why we feel like we need police. because I think like the issue of incarceration and policing are like so big and so important, but there's also so many deep psychological barriers to understanding why they're harmful. And I think that we need to be talking about like the thing underneath the thing before we can actually like do the work of abolition. I think we should still be doing the work of abolition, but I really love therapy and I really love therapy techniques. And I think that there's a lot to be said for dealing with the root cause, which is the goal of abolition. So.
Yeah, I mean, kind of to echo both Katrina and Jasmine, hoping in what we've been doing, both with work on the task force as a representative of BLM OKC, along with two other people, Sheree and Josh. We haven't had any, we are hopeful.
Sorry, can I interject really quickly, Josh? Sorry, can you clarify what you mean by the task force for folks who maybe aren't familiar with what the task force is?
I want to see if I put this diplomatically. So the task force is something that has taken up a lot of time every 2 weeks for the past year. What it is something that was created in the wake of the uprising that we had here, the summer of 2020. And it was something that the mayor put together. And the point of it was to have this group of individuals, which started with about 40 and now has like 47, to look at and review police policies regarding de-escalation and also civilian oversight. And so we've been spending our time doing that. One of the things that has been an important part of that is trying to get people to look at things that traditionally are labeled as crime in terms of harm, because what we want to do is reduce harm. Because crime itself is a political category, and police very often are people who perpetrate harm, they don't prevent it. And so trying to shift that in the discussion has been a huge part of it. And then trying to go from that to talking about the money, as we've said, and where that could best be used to reduce harm. And that's been a big part of what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's great. Really helpful. Thank you. So we have a number of questions that we've written out for this evening. As Katrina mentioned, I think as maybe you as the listener have observed before, this is a big topic that often goes in many directions. So for our panelists, I'm going to use our questions more as like guardrails and guiding questions and let the conversation travel where it may. I think I want to start with the distinction between divestment and defunding. And there are very clear differences in divestment and defunding campaigns. I think if each of you could talk a little bit about the goals of your efforts, the things that you're involved with, and share with us, like, I think Josh maybe just did this, right? What the vision for success in that work looks like. I think maybe actually now that I'm saying that out loud, Jasmine also did this already, but if there's anything that you wanted to add about like what does a specific tangible success around either divestment or defunding look for you in your organizing, look like for you in your organizing?
I don't mind starting. I guess I would add that while the campaign that we were working on with Make It Right Project was a divestment, I think it's important to say that while we live in Oklahoma and we live in a place where we can't use the word abolition, right, without being run out of the room or being told that that's not possible, that's crazy, right? And so with the Make It Right Project, our plan was that let's start from divestment, but knowing that the goal at the end of the day is abolition, abolition of policing systems and moving toward public safety services, because that's what we should have. And so I think we did see some things similar to what defund could look like in Norman, when the Norman folks were able to convince the city council to lower the budget as a whole, the policing budget as a whole. So I think that's an area where we did see some work towards defunding, and what could, I think, the closest of what defunding looks like in Oklahoma. I want to hear, I think it looks like Josh had something to say to add.
I agree completely with Jasmine. And one of the things that I would add too with Make It Right, and even with some of the stuff that all of us have done with the task force, is actually look at the numbers. People do not understand the police budget or generally the municipal budget. Number one, because they're boring as hell. Number two, because the people in charge of like dispensing the funds don't actually understand the budgets either. As we found out, like the people actually in charge of the police budget can't answer the majority of questions that we have posed to them. There are just huge sums of money that are kind of going into the same pot that they've gone in for years and years and years. So actually getting people to look at this kind of gets that conversation, gets people thinking about, well, maybe we shouldn't be funding these things anyway, since we're not really sure what the money is going to. And since they don't want to tell us what it's going to.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of one of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight was this like municipal budget process for sure. I think even as a person who has been involved in the process, thinking about the process, knowing sort of how to get plugged in, maybe by my own desire to know about it. If folks who are listening have never engaged, like where do you start? I think maybe Katrina, if you would answer this question first, because I think of the folks who I know on this call, you're the newest to this kind of organizing. Like, how did you start? How did you decide that you wanted to be involved? Where did you look? Where did you go? What did you follow? That kind of stuff.
It's a good question. The answer for me, which is not accessible to everyone, is honestly getting to know you and Nicole. They're amazing, so like you should get to know them, but I think getting involved, it's hard because it's so inaccessible. And I think like the best way to learn what's going on is to go to meetings, which are during the day and can sometimes go literally all day long, which is not feasible for most of us. A really good option is to follow OKC Span on Twitter. Marty goes to all of the municipal meetings, pretty much all of them, and like live tweets them, and then has write-ups in the Free Press about what happens. And so much of this work is just about our attention. We have to like really be paying attention because so many things happen because they shove things through, like too many things. The quickest things that happen in meetings can have a dramatic impact, and it's all in legalese and it's really hard to follow. But you can also reach out to your city council person or your county commissioner. Your elected officials are there to serve you, and they should answer their emails. And if they don't, maybe you make that public. Was that a good answer? I don't know.
Sorry, Jasmine, I'll just ask you. I think one of the other things that I want to hear is, you have all named organizations and ways to plug in there. I think one of the other big barriers that I often hear from folks is like, I don't know what the process is. I don't know where we are at in the process. When do I get involved? When is it happening? Jasmine, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually kind of wanted to add something about accessibility. So that is something that we found was incredibly hard. It's like, how do we bring this incredibly difficult process down? And so there are some, what we did was we created some like images and media around like explaining, here's how you can put in a public comment. Here's how you can, talk to your city council person. You can talk to somebody who doesn't represent you, and just sharing ideas like that. And I know that around the time of budgets, if you kind of pay attention to OKC-SPAN, they're really good at retweeting. A lot of the city councilors are also good at retweeting materials that make it helpful. So following all of, if you live in the OKC Metro, follow all of the city councilors that are in the Metro, and you'll find a lot of times that they are sharing some materials that make the process seem a little easier. But yeah, so what happens is so in the beginning, the OKCPD puts together their own budget actually, and they present it to the city council. And the city council takes that and they are allowed to review it, and then it goes up for a vote. But there is a time period in review in which there can be public comment. And so what that means is that any person within the OKC Metro or OKC city limits that belongs to any of the wards can propose a public statement. So you can either write it and submit it by email. They had at some point a link online that just directed you to another email to send it to. And then you can also show up to the city council meetings. Again, these are during the day at 8 a.m. And because they are budget meetings, they will go long because there are a lot of questions. What the OKC did this year is that each budget item, because the budget is made as a whole for the city, and as a part of the city budget, you'll find the policing budget is together. And so they will have a specific meeting for public comment at the city council meeting about policing budget and fire budget alone. There's nothing else that can be talked about that day, just the policing budget as it comes up. I found that was just incredibly inaccessible. There should have been other ways for the community to be involved. And I also think it should be stated that the police department making their own budget is a red flag in its own. In fiscal year 2022, because the budget is created every year, we saw a $1.3 million increase. So it went from a $226 million budget for OKCPD to a $227.7 million budget. So we saw a $1.3 million increase. But in looking back at the last 4 years, what we actually found is very alarming. We saw, I believe it was a 12.6% increase in the budget. So this is an incredible amount that was gained in the last 4 years, and going through 2 chief of polices. So what we did is we went ahead and we did an analysis of the last 4 budgets and saw where the difference in budget was. There was an allocation to a whole new department of like administrative work. There was several hundreds of thousands of dollars allocated to like something like 20 new police officers on the force that raised the budget. There were several things that were added over the last 4 years that accumulated to getting to $227 million, but with very little question as to why. In the budget, we also found that when building out this $227 million budget, there in some places where there was maybe $6 million being spent, there were only 4 line items for that $6 million. And when asked so this one line item says this is $600,000 and it says for resources. What does that mean, right? There's no tracking to say what that $600,000 is for. And so just an incredible amount of lack of accountability and lack of transparency. And it's just something that is extremely alarming and cannot continue moving forward if we're able to have any kind of form of accountability over the police department.
I also think it's important to note that so often city council is just there to rubber stamp things that are done by the city manager. Craig Freeman is the city manager. That is not an elected position. We have no say in who that is or how they do their job. That's a problem, especially when the city manager doesn't really seem to want to listen to people.
Yeah, and to add something to that, that I think can be helpful in understanding city budgets generally is looking at historically, like historically speaking, everyone's kind of heard of mayors or city council members that you vote into office. But the notion of having a city manager is relatively new and is actually a neoliberal sort of like innovation. You had a lot of cities that were struggling budget-wise during the 70s. And so you had emergency city managers that were put in place to try to help with the finances of the city. And then these things became permanent positions, right? And so this sort of like manager who is unelected and has basically say over every department as far as personnel, other things like that, and can just shift around the money. We saw that actually, this could end up being a good thing, but before the program, there were some pilot programs that we're going to be hopefully getting in the city, one of them for a mental health alternative response. The city manager was able to just set aside $300,000 for this pilot program before the program itself has been approved of, which seems kind of like backwards, right? So the city manager really does have a ton, well, basically has most, if not all of the discretion over the way that the funds are managed.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to take a little bit of a detour, certainly not a detour from this conversation as a whole, but I want to take a detour from talking about the specifics of budget organizing to talk a little bit more about the experiences that each of you have had in the ways that carceral feminism has been used to prop up the prison industrial complex in Oklahoma City. And especially because it is often such a key piece, right, of the ways that resistance to dismantling the police state is framed. And I think maybe starting with Jasmine and then Katrina or Josh, whichever of you wants to jump in after that, can you tell us a little bit, Jasmine, about the ways that your organizing work at the municipal level or like in your local communities has come up against carceral feminism?
I think that we live in a state where criminalizing everything is normalized. So there is no way that we could be in an advocacy world or in an activist world. Even being an activist is criminalized. I was just having a conversation with somebody today about how it's normalized to live in DC and utilize your First Amendment to do a direct action. And it's not expected that you're going to be incarcerated in an overcapacitated jail and not whether or not you'll be let out, right? I think that in every aspect of this work, we have come across a criminalizing system in a state in which there is very little room to fight. I think that I want to reiterate that it's impossible to do this work as an activist to not come across that. So I would say in every aspect of my life as an activist, but as well as a Black woman living in Oklahoma.
I think I see this most in the sense that we like to detach ourselves from people that we deem as other and worthy of being imprisoned, especially white women. Historically, there's a lot of basis of white women using their perceived purity to kill Black people for no reason. And I think that culture, like Jasmine said, is pretty deep ingrained in Oklahoma. And yeah, we criminalize all sorts of things and also make it legal to do lots of harm, like driving cars into protesters. That's legal here.
I would say that one of the other things that you encounter here in Oklahoma is that people don't want to talk about sort of the root causes of harm, but are much more comfortable talking about why we need police because of this example or that example of something that was truly heinous, some sort of an act. So this, one of the subjects that comes up is, gender-based violence. Whenever that occurs, especially in a domestic setting, we need police to stop that. And it's one of those conversations that is very, very awkward to have because because it's set up such that if you disagree, then you're probably a horrible person, to the person you're having the conversation with. And so actually getting into talking about, well, in fact, the second most common complaint against police is in fact gender-based violence, right? And so that they themselves are, perpetrators of this particular type of harm. But then also going ahead and having that conversation whenever people say, well, what about the rapists? What about X, Y, and Z? And that's something that comes up all the time, right? And I think that one of the hardest things is that you really have to do a pretty deep dive and practice and have the conversations with other organizers, knowing how to address those sorts of questions, because they can be addressed. But you need to have good information to address them with, because what you're arguing for is something that is counterintuitive and that people are not prepared just in their imaginations to think of like having something else that could work better and not perpetrate harm like the police do.
Yeah, and I think maybe Josh or Jasmine, since you have been more directly involved a little bit in this kind of organizing directed at like the larger, the word is leaving my mind, committee is the word in my mind, task force is the word that I'm looking for, thank you. But like, can you talk maybe a little bit about some of the specific ways that carceral feminism has showed up in like the specific context of maybe the Oklahoma County Jail Trust or elected officials who are involved with organizations like Palomar and others who use a heavily carceral feminist framing, but carry a lot of political power in the city? If you're comfortable. If you're not, I, as an unaffiliated person, am happy to throw some input there.
I would say, kind of speaking to your question and also what Josh stated, I think we saw it in the budgeting process, and especially when Councilperson Cooper introduced his 6 resolutions. These were resolutions that were are planned to be helpful, that can be helpful to the policing system that we have now. These 6 resolutions offered alternatives to policing. So alternative mental health measures outside of the police department. We're talking intervention teams. We are talking forms of community policing in a way, and we're looking at alternatives. And when those proposals were brought before the city council, it almost felt like they read them and could not even bear to relate or want to understand it because of the lack of understanding of the systemic problems before we got here. And so I would definitely say it was within the process, because I felt like we were trying to explain a concept to the city, which they hadn't even recognized for themselves was an issue. And so I would definitely say throughout the entire process, we were fighting up against, it seemed like a brick wall, because they didn't even understand where we were coming from. It's like, we have this idea for an alternative, but it's like, why do we need an alternative? They've never even taken a step back to say, okay, to really understand or acknowledge even that systemic racism and systemic issues are within the policing system.
In fact, that makes me think of one of the first meeting, well, task force meeting that we were on, and this was several months into the process, where any of the community organizers even like let out half a smile was actually one of the community organizers who is from outside of Oklahoma. His name's Ray Kelly, and he's Baltimore, and did some of the presentations of different models of civilian oversight. All of a sudden, the representatives of the police, Fraternal Order of Police, and others had like a million questions and wanted to talk about everything. And at one point, Ray himself said, look, you guys are kind of like picking at my language concerning this, but you should understand we wouldn't be here if there wasn't a problem. Like, clearly, there's a problem within the department. You need to admit that, right? And we would go further in saying that, like, well, it's a problem with policing itself, right? But even getting, as Jasmine said, getting people to acknowledge, right, this history that lays behind most of these sorts of things is incredibly difficult and has to be a part of the process.
Yeah, I think I will take one moment of personal privilege to talk about my, my own experience, which I think is notable in the context of this question, right? As an organizer with State Question 805, working on that campaign, so much of the response to that state question was really deeply rooted in carceral feminism, and really reflected and kind of exposed for a lot of people the ways in which victim services organizations or survivor services organizations are deeply tied to and embedded with police departments. And it creates this difficult environment for folks who are interested, I think, in the values that we share in this space to engage, because they trust organizations. I named Palomar, but many organizations across the state of Oklahoma. Palomar certainly not the only organization that relies on its relationship with the police in order to create situations where people who have experienced violence of some kind feel empowered to resolve their situations in ways that they understand, which often looks like involving the criminal justice system for folks. Does not always, right? And for many specific types of people, for trans people, for queer people, for trans women of color, for Black women, may look explicitly like not involving the police, right? But often, if that is the choice of the person, right, those organizations have to rely on deep relationships and deep ties with the department with departments across the state in order for those folks to feel like they can access what they want and what they need, right? And so I think that there are really interesting and really deep ways that these organizations and this larger environment, beyond what we think about, beyond municipal budgets, beyond some of these ways where it feels easy to identify the ways that carceral feminism shows up in our communities, that we have to look a little bit harder for. And I think too, and be careful ourselves about like falling into the trap of that kind of thinking. I think this brings us to a great moment to kind of start to shift into like futures as we draw into the last 15 or so minutes here together. I think if we're not spending, right, if we are successful, we have these moments where we find joy in asking that question of if that $600,000 is not going to the police department, if we're not spending tens of millions of dollars, $227 million, right, on policing at the municipal level in Oklahoma City, where does that money go instead? Maybe we'll start, I don't know. We can start with Katrina, maybe. I heard you talk a little bit about what your vision was before, so I'd love for you to expand.
I think the first thing that I would want that money to go to personally is to get people in homes. Homelessness is often used as a predictor for crime. There's so many other things that go into that. And there's so much like trauma related to that. And we know that crime is a construct and harm happens mainly because people have needs or have experienced violence and trauma. And there's so much that we could provide for people in this city with that money, starting with homes, mental health services, street teams that aren't at all related to the police, that could be response teams. We could do community trainings for de-escalation. We could start community gardens so people could meet their neighbors and actually form those community bonds to create safety within their own blocks. Endless. There are endless options for what we could do to create safety that's better than what we're doing now.
I know that one of the specific things that I've been working on, and actually a lot of us have been working on, even within the setting of the task force, is specifically trying out a mental health crisis alternative response to the police. And one of the reasons why a lot of attention has been focused on that is because that seemed to be one of the few things, at least within the setting of the task force, that everyone kind of agreed on. A lot of these calls that the police themselves were going out on, they did not want to be called out to those. They know, even the ones who are, have the crisis intervention training or whatnot, they know they're not mental health care professionals. And very often they're not a part of that community regardless. And so every time they show up, they are escalating things by their mere presence. So it seemed to be one of those few points of, I wouldn't say agreement, but everyone kind of yeah, we don't think maybe that sending in people who are armed to de-escalate a situation with someone who is in a psychotic episode or something is the best way to handle it. And we need people who are trained and who are invested in the community themselves and care about the people to actually be responding. Not someone who's going to put it down with violence. And so I know that for myself, at least, that's a huge area. And it's incredibly important that it be and it remain separate from the police, completely separate. We know that, for instance, the COPES program in Tulsa is responsible, at least for, I think, the death of Joshua Barre and a few other individuals, because a co-responder program also is still bringing the police into the situation. And very often all that happens with that is you simply kind of take now a licensed social worker and turn them into another police officer, but one without a gun. But they're only there because they have someone with a gun. So making sure that it's separate and that money is going toward that, and that it's funding it so that we have people who can, actually go and sit with folks too, because that's another big part of this. Very often someone who is experiencing a mental health crisis, they need someone who can spend time with them to work through things. Well, the police themselves, they're trying to get things done as quickly as possible. And that is, you're asking for a disaster every single time. So yeah, I would say that for myself, at least, that's kind of been the focus, is on the mental health care alternative response.
You guys have said so much, but honestly, a lot of the points that I wanted to talk on, but something that I wanted to share is we used a slogan in the Make It Right project, was refunding the people, rather than spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on policing. If we refund the people, in my mind, I see that as a way that money should, if there is $227 million to be used on a harmful policing department, then there is $227 million to be used on folks who are unhoused. Then there is $100,000 to be used on an alternative to policing. And there's $50,000 to fund somebody who is going to be within a violence interruption program in a community in which they need they need a member or a person from the community that they recognize to help to ease a situation. Like Josh said, but bringing police into any situation is an automatic escalation. bringing even a uniform, even if they're unarmed, a uniform of any kind into a situation is an escalation. So I think that this money, in my eyes, if there's money for policing this, for funding this harmful policing system, then there's money to be found to fund these systems and services that we know are not harmful and should be funded and allocated with intention.
Yeah, I think that's great. There is a question in the chat from a friend of the group, Comrade Aurelius. How can folks in Oklahoma City get plugged into this work that all of you have been talking about? And maybe we'll start with Jasmine and go around.
I can definitely give a plug on how you can keep up with what is happening with the task force. I think that's probably the most accessible way to be involved in this work right now. The task force is still deliberating. Technically, they have been given, the consulting group to the task force has given their recommendations. And so in the coming weeks, you'll see some finalizations of the recommendations and then steps as to what happens next with those recommendations on changes to policing. So you can actually go to okc.gov, and I think it's like /task force. I'll look it up and throw it in the chat here in a minute, but there is a tab that is specifically on the okc.gov page where you can find all of the information. You can find the written recommendation and there's a list of, I believe it's 22 recommendations from the consulting group of what needs to be changed to policing. I think it'd be really cool if you guys could check that out because it's got some really awesome changes that would be honestly just monumental in what policing looks like in OKC.
So I would also say that anytime, going to some of the organizations, whether it be the ACLU, Foundation for Liberating Minds, Black Lives Matter OKC, lots of different organizations will at least mention whenever there are things like community conversations, right? Or different meetings of various groups. I think that that's important too, is making sure to not just like learn about what is happening, but go and discuss with other people in the community. Like you cannot think independently when you're alone. You need to be with other people in the community to be able to do it. So, talking to friends, family members, whoever else, and trying to get other people going to community conversations like this, or to city council meetings, or talking to city council members outside of a meeting setting, right, is incredibly important. I think that's probably a good place to get started.
I also think the work of abolition starts in relationships that we already have. I have been trying to talk to my mom and my grandma about their ideas about people who create harm and how we handle those things. And they are some very laden with emotional conversations. But people are going to listen to you if you already have a relationship with them and you can like have those conversations. And I think even if you're not able to go to a meeting in the city, you can have conversations with your friends, your family, your neighbors, and start like questioning some of these ideas of, but why are we doing this if it's not really working? But lots of people have died, and like police show up after a crime's committed. They don't actually stop crime. A lot of it you can get to just by being curious and not judgmental, to quote Ted Lasso. And just start having those conversations and getting people thinking. So much of this is work of imagination. Like Mariam Kaba talks about, we have to be able to see something different if we're going to do something different. So, and that's a skill that you can build.
Yeah, I love that. Thinking about it as a skill that you can build is really, I think, really helpful. Being involved in your municipal government is a skill that you can build. Just because you feel like you don't know nothing now, you could be involved in this, I don't know, say like 10 years of your career later and still feel like you sort of mostly know nothing and learn new things every day. Because that is the nature of how comprehensive and how big, not just the organizing space, the policy space, the abolition space, right? But that all of these things are so deeply rooted in our world that there is an endless amount of opportunity for you to get engaged. And I know that that can feel both overwhelming, but I hope that you will think of it as exciting, because it means that you can figure out the ways that you're able to show up that are best for you, the relationships that you hold, and the communities that you care deeply about. I think that we want to take these last few minutes to plug on at least one more way that you can get involved, which is to continue to join us against carceral feminism in our collective action spaces. You can find all of the details for this on on the Instagram. I guess not our Instagram, but on the Foundation for Liberating Minds Instagram, which they generously, share the information for our upcoming events. That's at Foundation for #4 LM, and I believe the link will be in the chat again. The collective action space in October is October 15th, so the third Friday of October. And we hope that you'll join Against Carceral Feminism for that conversation, to continue thinking and talking about how we can grow this work in our community together. We do also have a very specific ask of all of you before you shut your laptop this evening. Maybe if you have already, or even if you haven't, it never hurts to do it again. We are asking that all of you, again, before you shut your laptop this evening, reach out to Governor Stitt and ask him to commute the sentence of Julius Jones. If you are not up to date, the Pardon and Parole Board has recommended that Julius's sentence be commuted. But despite that, the state issued an execution date of November 18th for Julius. So this is an urgent moment in a case that we know we can win. We know that we won the Pardon and Parole Board, and that an innocent man does not deserve to die. So I hope that tonight you're able to take just a few minutes to fill out the form. You can find it at Justice for Julius Jones. Oops, I sent that as a direct message. I'll send that to everyone. justiceforjuliusjones.com/action. It's there in the chat. It's like 3 clicks if you just Google Julius Jones. And my ask for you would be that if you have already completed this form tonight, that you not just complete it again and send an additional message to Governor Stitt, but that you take the time to share on your social media or make the direct ask of 5 of your loved ones to send that message as well. Like I said, this is truly an urgent moment in a fight that we have, I think, all been putting a lot of effort into. So yes, as Kelly points out, the email is pre-written. You can just hit send and add your name to this effort, and it can and will make all the difference. I think this is not in the email, so I apologize, but I would love to close with my favorite question, which is, in your dream world without policing, what does community look like to you? And I love to just close on that moment and that note, and to remind us that we are rooted in dreaming of a future that we deserve and that we can have as we grow and fight together. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What does that world look like? Maybe let's start with Josh and go in like reverse order here.
I would say the first thing is that it's not a world without harm, which is important to note, but it's a world that recognizes harms and tries to reduce them, where it's met with communities and not systems of governance that have their historical origin in structures of white supremacy.
Katrina?
So I grew up in rural Indiana, and our neighbor had a garden. His name was Jim. Great guy. He shared all of the things that he grew with like all of the neighbors that were close to him. My brother mowed the lawn of a different neighbor. I went and spent a lot of time with older neighbors down the street. And I think that that has really shaped how I view community care. I think that we need to know our neighbors, and we need to know what's going on with our neighbors, and we need to know what they need and how to take care of them. Yeah.
My dream world or community is a place where every person looks at the person in front of them, no matter where they are, and look at them with humanity, and remembering that no matter their past, no matter their future, no matter where they are now, whether you know them or you don't know them, understanding that there's humanity. And I love what you said, AC, the human dignity is not conditional. That is going to stick with me for a long time, because I think that if every person can really look at at another person, maybe somebody who is unhoused and struggling on the street, and look at them in a way to say that like this is a person, not somebody who is just a body in a world. It is truly a person with a life of their own, whether you know their life or not, and understanding that our struggles are not their struggles, but it is our, even though it is not our struggle, it is our duty to make sure that we see them as human, and we do what we can to just be there in any capacity, in whatever way that person needs.
Yeah, I love that. Well, so your homework, as it were, or your takeaway, the things that we ask you to do are to send that action email before you log off this evening, or maybe while you're cooking dinner from your phone. Share that action with your friends and your family and make that ask of them. And my ask of you is that you do a little bit of imagining what the future looks like for you when we win. Or what the future looks like for you, because holding that vision close to your heart can do you a lot of good. So all futures are possible, and I hope that each and every one of you has as good of a week and as good of an evening as you can. And we'll see you on October 15th for our next collective action space. Thanks for joining, folks.